The early dawn light struggled to pierce the vast, arid mountains near the New Mexico border, painting the rugged landscape in hues of muted purple and dusty rose. It was a time of quiet, a time of routine, when the world felt ancient and predictable. Elena and Mateo, on their usual morning rounds, checking the perimeter fences of their small communal farm, moved with the practiced ease of those who knew every rock, every crevice, every whisper of the wind. They were accustomed to the stark beauty and the demanding rhythms of this land, but nothing in their experience prepared them for the scene that unfolded before them. Nestled among a cluster of jagged, sun-baked rocks, a man lay slumped, a cowboy, gravely wounded and eerily still. His body was a tableau of quiet devastation, a stark, unwelcome splash of crimson against the ochre earth. A loyal sentinel, his horse stood guard nearby, its breath misting in the cool morning air, whinnying low and nervously. The sound, a clear sign of distress and danger, echoed across the desolate expanse, a primal lament for its fallen rider. The immediate visceral shock of finding a human life hanging by a thread in such a remote, unforgiving place seized Elena and Mateo, stopping them dead in their tracks. It wasn't the man himself who represented disrespect, but the brutal, unknown force that had left him for dead, and the inherent, terrifying risk his very presence now posed to their peaceful, albeit vulnerable, existence. Their eyes met across the rugged terrain, a silent, shared glance that spoke volumes of unspoken fears. Their community, nestled precariously close to the border, lived under the constant shadow of political tensions, where strangers often meant trouble, and help could be a dangerous act of defiance. Yet, in that moment, compassion outweighed caution. Mateo's jaw tightened, a resolute nod passing between them. They would help. It was an unexpected, calculated reaction born not of recklessness, but of a deep-seated humanity that transcended the invisible lines drawn on maps. The initial struggle to move the heavy, unconscious body was harrowing. Each strained lift, each careful step over the uneven ground was an agony of effort. The horse, its dark eyes watchful and intelligent, followed their every move, a silent, equine guardian ensuring no further harm came to its master. With every labored breath, every bead of sweat that trickled down their brows, the profound weight of a stranger's life settled upon their shoulders. This grim discovery had instantly, irrevocably shifted their day, their routine, their very sense of security. The peaceful dawn was shattered, replaced by an urgent, life-altering mission. They knew the consequences could be dire. Their community had learned, through generations of hardship, to be wary, to protect their own, to avoid entanglement with the world beyond their fences. But as they finally managed to hoist the man onto the back of Mateo's sturdy mule, a quiet truth resonated within Elena. In the face of suffering, humanity knows no borders. The scene ended with the rhythmic, heavy thud of the mule's hooves carrying its inert burden, the loyal horse trotting alongside. They brought the man back to their small, communal farm, his identity a complete mystery, his fate, and theirs, hanging precariously in the balance. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you're watching from in the comments. To understand the true weight of Elena and Mateo's decision, one must first understand the ground beneath their feet, the sky above their heads, and the ceaseless hum of a life lived on the precipice. Their small, resilient community was etched into the rugged, sun-baked earth, a collection of adobe homes clinging to the foothills of mountains that bled into the New Mexico border. Here, the air was thick with the scent of dry dust and wild sage, and the silence was often broken only by the wind's mournful sigh or the distant lowing of cattle. Life was a relentless cycle, dictated by the unforgiving sun and the scarce, precious water. Every morning, before the desert truly woke, Elena and Mateo rose with the first blush of dawn. Their days unfolded in a rhythm as old as the land itself, tending to the communal farm, a patchwork of stubborn crops coaxed from the arid soil, and caring for the few livestock that provided sustenance. Every hand contributed, every task was shared, forging bonds stronger than blood. Mealtimes were sacred, a noisy, joyful gathering around long wooden tables laden with simple, nourishing food, where stories were exchanged and laughter echoed against ancient walls. Family wasn't just a unit, it was the very fabric of their existence, the unbreakable thread weaving through generations, offering solace and strength in a world that often felt indifferent, if not hostile. Yet, beneath this facade of peaceful communal living lay a pervasive, unspoken tension. The border, a mere whisper away, was less a line on a map and more a living, breathing entity that cast a long, chilling shadow over their lives. It was a constant reminder of external forces, of powers beyond their control. The community lived in a perpetual state of vigilance, their eyes habitually scanning the horizon, not just for weather changes but for the telltale dust plumes of approaching vehicles, be they cartel patrols, whose presence instilled a cold, calculating fear, or the stark, imposing figures of the Border Patrol, whose authority was often felt as an arbitrary and demeaning intrusion. Elena, with her quiet strength and eyes that held the wisdom of generations, carried a deep empathy within her. She longed for a life of simple peace and stability for her children, a future free from the constant anxiety that gnawed at the edges of their existence. Her vulnerability wasn't weakness, but a profound yearning for a world where humanity transcended artificial lines. Matteo, on the other hand, was fiercely protective, his pragmatism a necessary shield against the harsh realities of their environment. He wrestled internally with the constant dilemma: how much caution was enough to ensure their survival, and when did caution become a betrayal of their shared humanity? His heart, though guarded, was as open as Elena's, especially when confronted with undeniable suffering. Their shared dream was a quiet prayer whispered into the desert winds, to raise their children in dignity, instilling in them the values of their ancestors, far removed from the political maelstrom that so often defined their region. The border, then, was not merely a geographical feature, it was an antagonist, an ever-present force shaping every decision, every hope, every fear. It was the silent arbiter of their destiny, dictating the terms of their vulnerability and their resilience. This deep-seated context, this delicate balance of communal strength and pervasive fear, was the emotional backdrop against which Elena and Matteo's extraordinary act of compassion unfolded. To bring a wounded stranger, a gringo cowboy, into their home was not simply an act of kindness. It was a profound act of courage, a quiet defiance against the ingrained fears that had been etched into the very soul of their community. It was a testament to the enduring belief that, even in the most fractured of worlds, the call of shared humanity could still resonate louder than the stark lines of division. The very air in their small, resilient community carried the weight of history, a silent testament to generations of accumulated grievances and a deep-seated distrust that permeated every interaction with the world beyond their immediate valley. It wasn't merely the harshness of the desert that sculpted their caution, but the indelible marks left by a legacy of broken promises and unfulfilled assurances from external authorities, especially those representing the U.S. Border Patrol. For as long as anyone could remember, their ancestors had spoken of agreements made and then casually disregarded, particularly concerning ancestral land rights and precious water access. Rivers that once flowed freely through their fields were diverted, wells ran dry, and the vibrant lifeblood of their agricultural existence slowly receded, leaving behind a bitter taste of abandonment and exploitation. These were not isolated incidents, but rather a relentless tide of veiled humiliations that chipped away at their dignity. Matteo, even in his youth, recalled countless stories from his grandfather: arbitrary stops on dusty roads, vehicles searched without cause, and the constant probing questions that served no purpose other than to assert dominance and reinforce a painful sense of being less than in the very land their families had tilled for centuries. Elena, too, carried the echoes of her grandmother's quiet tears, shed over loved ones who disappeared into the labyrinth of the border, never to return, or those who were summarily deported, their lives shattered by policies that seemed to view them not as people, but as statistics or threats. The uniform, regardless of the individual wearing it, represented a system that had consistently failed them, often actively harming them. Beyond the official channels, the community had also learned to navigate the treacherous waters of manipulation. Various factions, some local, some from across the border, preyed on their fears, offering false protection or empty promises, exploiting their vulnerabilities. This constant pressure, this invisible hand pulling at the fabric of their trust, had forged a climate of suspicion so profound it was almost genetic. Every stranger, every unusual event was filtered through this lens of historical betrayal. The tales of stark injustice were not abstract concepts. They were woven into the very fabric of their oral traditions. Families torn apart by invisible lines, livelihoods destroyed by sudden raids, innocent people caught in the crossfire of political agendas. These were the bedrock of their collective memory. The resilience of their people was born not just from enduring the desert sun, but from surviving these systemic wounds. They learned to be self-sufficient, to rely only on each other, to speak in quiet tones, and to watch the horizon with an unnerving vigilance. This wasn't paranoia, it was a learned survival instinct, honed over generations. They understood the nuances of quiet suffering, the strength found in communal solidarity, and the profound, aching sense of injustice that simmered beneath their outwardly calm demeanor. The moment Elena and Mateo discovered the wounded cowboy, slumped amidst the jagged rocks, was not merely an isolated act of misfortune. It was rather the final, heavy drop in a long, overflowing history of emotional and social erosion. His presence, an unknown entity from the very world that had inflicted so much pain, instantly triggered every ingrained fear, every whispered warning, every historical wound. Their decision to help, born of pure human compassion, was a radical act, a defiance of everything their history had taught them about outsiders. It was a choice made against the backdrop of generations of mistrust, a fragile bridge built over an abyss of resentment. The audience must now grasp the immense weight of this choice. They must understand that when the injured man's true identity inevitably comes to light, the community's reaction will be far from simple. It will be a tempest of conflicting emotions, fear, anger, betrayal. But also, perhaps, the faint flicker of the same humanity that compelled Elena and Mateo to act. This man, a gringo cowboy, represented not just himself, but a historical adversary, a symbol of the very system that had caused them so much suffering. His fate, and the fate of the couple who saved him, would become inextricably linked to this legacy of distrust, creating a complex, perilous dance between justice and forgiveness, between vengeance and empathy. The valley, once a place of quiet endurance, was now poised on the precipice of an emotional reckoning, with the wounded stranger at its volatile heart. The quiet endurance of the valley, so long a source of strength, began to fray under the strain of Daniel's presence. Days bled into weeks, each one a testament to Elena and Mateo's tireless care, but also a slow-burning fuse. Daniel, the wounded cowboy, lay in their spare room, his physical wounds gradually mending under Elena's gentle ministrations and Mateo's watchful eye. He was a man of few words, even in his moments of lucidity, his gaze often distant, haunted by shadows that flickered behind his eyes. His silence, once a mercy, now felt like a heavy shroud, amplifying the unspoken fears that began to circulate like desert dust devils. No secret, however well guarded, could long withstand the close-knit scrutiny of their community. Whispers, subtle as the rustle of dry leaves, began to weave through the adobe homes. A strange horse had been seen. A light burned late in Elena and Mateo's window. The scent of unfamiliar remedies wafted on the evening air. Soon the initial curiosity morphed into apprehension, then outright alarm. The identity of the man remained unknown, but his very existence was a stark, undeniable disruption, a dangerous anomaly in their carefully preserved world. Conflicts, once simmered beneath the surface of communal harmony, began to boil over. Old man Pedro, his face a roadmap of generations of hardship, would corner Mateo by the well, his voice low and urgent. "You bring trouble, son. Always trouble with outsiders. Remember what happened to the Rojas family? They let a stranger in, and look what became of them?" Others, younger but no less fearful, echoed his sentiments. Maria, a mother of 4, openly questioned Elena's judgment at the communal wash basin. "Is it wise, Elena? To keep him? What if he brings more than just himself? What if they come looking for him?" The arguments were often heated, fueled by a potent cocktail of historical trauma and immediate, tangible fear. Every past encounter with border agents, every story of cartel violence, every memory of injustice, was invoked as a reason to expel the stranger. The social pressure on Elena and Mateo became an almost physical weight. They felt the silent judgment of elders in their solemn, averted gazes during shared meals. Friends, once quick with a joke or a helping hand, now offered nervous questions, their eyes darting to the couple's home. Overt suspicion from others hardened into cold stares. They were ostracized, not with angry words, but with a chilling distance, a silent disapproval that spoke volumes. Even their own children, acutely sensitive to the pervasive anxiety, began to ask questions, their innocent queries piercing the fragile shield Elena and Matteo tried to maintain. "Mama, why is that man here? Will they come?" The children's fear, palpable and unvarnished, was a sharp reminder of the profound risk they had taken, the security they had unwittingly jeopardized for an unknown life. Daniel, for his part, remained a figure of quiet, unsettling tension. Though his body slowly regained strength, his posture, even when resting, held a coiled intensity. His eyes, though often unfocused in the haze of recovery, sometimes snapped with an alert, almost feral watchfulness. He was a man clearly accustomed to danger, to living on the edge, a past he was not yet ready, or perhaps able, to reveal. This unspoken history, evident in his very bearing, only served to deepen the community's suspicions, painting him as a potential threat rather than merely a victim. Fragmented memories began to plague Daniel's fitful sleep. Elena, sitting by his bedside, would sometimes hear guttural cries, hushed curses, or terrified gasps escaping his lips. He spoke of flashes of violence, the metallic tang of blood, the searing burn of betrayal. He muttered names she didn't recognize, spoke of a desperate flight through unforgiving terrain, and the chilling certainty that someone, or something, was still pursuing him. These disjointed whispers, pieced together by Elena and Matteo, hinted at a larger, far more dangerous story than a simple accident, a narrative that threatened to engulf not just Daniel, but their entire community in its violent wake. This was the moment of greatest emotional suffocation, where Elena and Matteo's compassionate act, once a source of quiet pride, now felt like an unbearable burden. The air crackled with unspoken accusations, with mounting fear, with the certainty that this precarious peace could not hold. An inevitable rupture loomed, a chasm opening between their humanitarian impulse and the community's desperate need for self-preservation. As Daniel regained consciousness, fragments of his past began to surface, disjointed images of violence and betrayal, a desperate flight from unseen enemies. He spoke haltingly, his words laced with pain, both physical and emotional. Elena and Matteo listened intently, their faces etched with concern, but also with a growing unease. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to assemble, painting a picture far more complex and dangerous than they had initially imagined. They had saved a man, but who was this man they had brought into their home, into their lives? The pivotal moment arrived unexpectedly during a quiet afternoon. Matteo was tending to Daniel's wounds, a grim task he approached with stoic determination. Daniel, propped up against the adobe wall, stared blankly ahead, lost in his thoughts. Suddenly he flinched, a wave of pain washing over his face. He reached for his shirt, fumbling with the buttons, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Matteo, concerned, moved closer to assist him. As Daniel's shirt fell open, a small leather pouch slipped from beneath it, landing softly on the dirt floor. Matteo picked it up, intending to return it to Daniel, but something about the weight and feel of the pouch gave him pause. He hesitated, his eyes meeting Daniel's, a silent question passing between them. Daniel's gaze was filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. With a sigh, he nodded slowly, granting Matteo permission to open the pouch. Inside, nestled among a few worn bills, was a tarnished silver badge. It was old, the inscription faded, but the words were still legible. U.S. Border Patrol. The revelation hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The fragile trust that had begun to blossom between Daniel and his rescuers shattered into a million pieces. Matteo stared at the badge, his face hardening, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of shock, anger, and betrayal. He looked at Daniel, no longer seeing a wounded man in need of help, but a symbol of the very force that had caused his community so much pain and suffering. Daniel's confession came in a rush of words, a desperate attempt to explain, to justify, to beg for understanding. He spoke of his past, his years as an agent, the reasons he had joined, the things he had seen, the choices he had made. He spoke of disillusionment, of regret, of the events that had led him to this desolate place, wounded and alone. He confessed that he was no longer with the USBP, that he had left after witnessing corruption and brutality he could no longer stomach. He had become a liability, and they tried to kill him. But his words fell on deaf ears. The truth had been revealed, and the truth was a bitter pill to swallow. The man they had saved, the man they had welcomed into their home, was an enemy, a representative of the system that had oppressed them for generations. The shockwaves of this discovery rippled through Elena and Mateo's home and would soon spread throughout the entire community. A simple act of rescue had transformed into a complex moral and political struggle, a confrontation with the very source of their fear and resentment. The truth, once a whispered suspicion, now thundered through the small community like a desert storm. Daniel, the wounded cowboy they had sheltered, the stranger whose life they had painstakingly saved, was a former agent of the U.S. Border Patrol. The revelation struck him with a force far greater than any physical blow he had endured. His nascent recovery, painstakingly nurtured by Elena and Mateo's quiet kindness, instantly faltered. Shame, a bitter, corrosive shame, washed over him, eclipsing the pain of his physical wounds. He lay there, not just a man recovering from an attack, but a living embodiment of betrayal, his presence a stark, agonizing contradiction to the compassion he had received. His internal world exploded into a maelstrom of conflicting emotions. The humanity Elena and Mateo had extended, the quiet care, the selfless risk they had taken, now stood in brutal contrast to the systemic dehumanization he had once been a part of. Every border crossing he had prevented, every family he had questioned, every policy he had enforced now replayed in his mind, seen through the eyes of those who had suffered. He was a prisoner of his own past, held captive by the very kindness he had been shown. The gratitude he felt was now laced with an unbearable guilt, rendering him mute, his gaze fixed on the adobe wall, unable to meet the eyes of his saviors. The fallout in the community was immediate and visceral. Whispers of his identity quickly de-escalated into agitated discussions, then into open accusations. A faction of neighbors, their faces etched with generations of resentment, became overtly hostile. They demanded his expulsion, some even advocating for turning him over to the very authorities he had once represented, seeing him as an enemy, a spy, a dangerous wolf in sheep's clothing. Their voices, once hushed in polite deference to Elena and Mateo, now carried an edge of fury, recalling past injustices, broken promises, and the unyielding shadow of the border. "He is one of them," they spat, their words poisoning the air. "He brings danger, not peace." Amidst the clamor, the elders, their faces lined with wisdom and weary experience, reacted with a different kind of fear. Their voices were softer, but their apprehension was palpable. They remembered the times when helping an outsider had led to unforeseen consequences, when the delicate balance of their existence had been shattered. Yet, some among them, like old Doña Rosa, the village healer, or the quiet, respected elder, Don Julio, expressed a reluctant understanding of Elena and Mateo's initial compassion. They didn't condone Daniel's past, but they recognized the universal call of suffering, advocating for a more nuanced approach, a path that honored shared humanity even amidst past grievances. This created a profound, unsettling divide within the tight-knit community, threatening to fracture its very foundation. Elena and Mateo, once pillars of their community, now found themselves under intense pressure. Their home, once a sanctuary, became a focal point of suspicion. Their loyalty was openly questioned, their decision to help the wounded man now seen as a dangerous, naive mistake. Ostracized by some, they faced the silent judgment of others, their usual greetings met with averted gazes or curt nods. Even those who stood by them did so nervously, their support tentative, aware of the precarious position it placed them in. The weight of communal disapproval, usually a powerful deterrent, pressed down on them, testing the very limits of their convictions. The cultural dynamics of their Mexican border community profoundly influenced every response. The deep-seated emphasis on community solidarity, the collective memory of injustice, and the ingrained distrust of external authority clashed violently with the tradition of hospitality and the inherent human desire to alleviate suffering. It was a crucible where ancient values met harsh, modern realities. Daniel, lying there, a ghost of his former self, became the living embodiment of this conflict, a mirror reflecting the community's deepest wounds and most profound moral dilemmas. The psychological impact on Daniel was devastating. He was forced to confront the full scope of his past actions, not through abstract policy discussions, but through the raw, unfiltered pain in the eyes of the people he had once patrolled. He saw the fear, the anger, the generational trauma, and he understood, with a chilling clarity, the consequences of the policies he had enforced. Stripped of his badge, his authority, and his sense of self-righteousness, he was left with only the stark, undeniable truth of his complicity. The man who had once stood on one side of an invisible line, enforcing its arbitrary rules, now found himself utterly exposed, vulnerable, and utterly alone on the other. He was no longer an agent. He was simply Daniel, a man broken by the very system he had served, now facing the judgment of those it had oppressed. His internal landscape was one of utter desolation, searching for a path to absolution that felt impossibly distant. The weight of the community's judgment settled heavily upon Daniel, crushing the last vestiges of his former self. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the true cost of his actions, the deep scars left on the hearts and minds of those he had once considered other. His apology, when it finally came, was not a carefully crafted speech of bureaucratic regret, but a raw, guttural outpouring of remorse, a desperate plea for understanding from the very people he had wronged. He spoke of the systemic injustices he had witnessed, the dehumanization he had participated in, the slow erosion of dignity he had been complicit in. He didn't offer excuses, only a willingness to bear the weight of his past and a fervent desire to make amends, however inadequate those amends might be. The community listened in stunned silence, their faces etched with a mixture of skepticism, anger, and a flicker of something akin to pity. Doña Rosa, her eyes filled with the wisdom of generations, stepped forward, her voice raspy but firm. "Words are wind, Daniel," she said. "It is your actions that will speak the truth." And so, Daniel began his path to redemption, not through grand gestures or self-serving acts of contrition, but through small, quiet acts of service. He used his knowledge of the border, gleaned from years of patrolling its desolate stretches, to warn the community of potential dangers, smugglers seeking to exploit their land, storms brewing in the mountains, the movements of predatory wildlife. He shared his survival skills, teaching them techniques for conserving water, finding food in the arid landscape, and protecting themselves from the elements. He helped repair damaged fences, tend to sick animals, and build stronger shelters, offering his labor without expectation of reward. Slowly, painstakingly, trust began to bloom. Not universally, but in small, fragile pockets. Children, less burdened by the weight of history, were the first to accept him, drawn to his quiet demeanor and his willingness to share stories of the land. Some of the younger men, initially hostile, began to see the value of his skills, learning from him how to navigate the treacherous terrain and protect their families. Elena and Mateo, vindicated by Daniel's transformation, found their own standing within the community restored. Their initial act of compassion, once seen as a reckless gamble, was now recognized as an act of profound courage, a testament to the enduring power of empathy. They became symbols of hope, proof that even the deepest divisions could be bridged, that even the most hardened hearts could be softened. Daniel never fully became one of them. The scars of his past were too deep, the cultural divide too wide. But he earned their respect, their grudging acceptance, and a new sense of purpose. He found redemption not in erasing his past, but in using it to build a better future, a future where understanding and compassion could triumph over fear and prejudice. The border, once a symbol of division and oppression, became a meeting place, a space where different cultures could learn from each other.